I'm super honored to be here on the AI track today. I'm especially honored to be following Richard Bartle, who I feel like sort of downplayed his contribution a little bit to the landscape of video games. So I've probably I think I've told Richard about this directly before, but I was a huge player of Mud 2 back in the day, but I actually came to it slightly later, after I spent most of my teen years really, really obsessed with one of its, I guess, spiritual successors, EverQuest. Was anyone else like hooked on EverQuest back in the day? No? God, who is this in this room? Honestly, okay, that's fine. So if you don't know EverQuest, it was this, it was obviously like an MMO. It was the first sort of big, one of the first big commercially successful MMOs, like 3D MMOs. And I'd never really played anything like it before, right? So it was this big, pervasive world which was kind of filled with characters and people and sort of just, you know, all these places you could go. And I just thought it was really magical. And I sort of didn't really know where the limits were, so I was ready to expect anything. So I want to reiterate, this was a game from about 19 years ago that I used to play it a lot. And the very first time I played, I remember I walked into sort of one of the starting areas, and there was this character who was kind of calling my name, right? So I went over, and my first, if anyone cares, my first main was a human enchanter. And I thought it was another player until I went and looked closer. And they said something like this, right? Like, "Hail, Kyria," which was the name of my character. "Care to hear more about my weapons?" And what I thought was really interesting about this game was that interaction with this character seemed to be via natural language, right? And I say seemed to be. First time I played, I said something like, "Yes, please. Tell me more about your weapons," right? So, you know, typing in like a full sentence like I would to another person. The second time I came across this NPC or another NPC, I just said something like, "What weapons," right? Because it's clearly being signposted what the keyword is that this NPC is looking for. And then finally, I just sort of, whenever I would see this signifier to sort of enter a keyword, I would just type it, right? So the mental model that I had of this conversation was not really of a conversation anymore. It was suddenly of more like typing in words into a search engine. And what's really interesting is that that's kind of the model of interaction that we have now with a lot of sort of personal assistants and things, right? So if you say like, "Hey Siri," like, "What's the temperature?" Like, you could say that, or you could just say, "Hey Siri, temperature," right? And you would get the same results. So the sort of model that we have of that interaction is, as I said, it's more like a search engine, not really of this naturalistic conversation that we might hope for. So why am I talking about a 19-year-old MMO and also about virtual assistants? Well, for both of those, so they're both sort of these novel input modalities, right, for interacting with computer systems in a way where they're represented as some kind of character. And they also aspire to use some kind of natural language. So there's this obvious big proliferation of sort of voice-activated personal assistants, right? And that kind of marks the disappearance of the interface into our everyday lives, right? We want things to be as frictionless as possible, as naturalistic as possible. If we want to add an appointment to our calendar via Siri or Google Assistant or whatever, we just want to say, you know, add appointment 3 o'clock, Thursday, whatever, rather than going and typing it in, right? So we want fewer specific literacies that are required when someone is interacting with our system. And so part of that is that we're moving towards this sort of representing our machines as these conversational entities or even more human-like. At the same time, there's this sort of turn towards simulated characters as well out in the world beyond games, but still in entertainment. For example, the thing I'm very excited about is the Disney Star Wars Hotel, which is supposedly full of sort of characters that you can interact with. So I think we're in this real cultural moment right now where the idea of naturalistic interaction with characters is really becoming popular. So alongside all of this, there's some really interesting trends as well percolating sort of side by side. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is where AI comes into the intersection of all these points. So firstly, there's personal assistants and things like I've just mentioned. There's also, obviously, the massive popularity of narrative games. So yesterday, in the business track, we heard from Pixelberry Studios about the massive success of their game Choices. And there's a huge audience for stories about characters and their interactions. Also, I think there have been some really interesting examples of sort of what I like to think of as pervasive sort of simulated SMS games. So a game like Bury Me, My Love, which was this really wonderful, critically acclaimed game that came out, I believe, last year. So what I think is really interesting is how we're in this sort of moment where all of these things are happening at the same time, and I think that AI can really help with that. OK, so just to sort of step back and introduce myself as well. So actually, the other point I wanted to make is that AI can sort of help with all of that, and also that you don't necessarily need to be a machine learning engineer. And this is the point I really want to underscore. You don't need to be somebody who is an AI expert. I think that that type or that modality of game design should be available to all game designers and writers and narrative designers, right? So we basically want this proliferation of games which are about characters and story and narrative in sort of an automated way, but still as a specifically designed experience. OK, so as well as being an indie game designer and a developer, I was also on the founding team of a company called Spirit AI, where basically we make tools that you can use to create rich, dynamic, conversational AI for games or chatbots or beyond. And basically, so I'm also assistant arts professor at NYU Game Center, so I teach sort of digital and non-digital design and do research as well. And basically, a lot of my work and expertise is framed around this, right? How to design for compelling emotional and cognitive involvement with simulated characters. So I look at this sort of from all kinds of angles. OK, so all of this leads to sort of these great and interesting possibilities for how AI can enable what I refer to as character-based conversational sims. And I want to talk specifically today about 4 types of expressive interactions that AI can make possible. And this is all stuff that's possible right now, right? Not necessarily sort of far-off future stuff. And I say expressive interaction as well for a reason. So the dream, obviously, with sort of interacting with characters is to be able to talk to them naturally and have them actually understand you and respond meaningfully. Right? So that's the sort of the model I initially had when I went and talked to that first NPC in EverQuest. I was hoping that they would understand me and respond and not just respond to keywords. So when we feel, though, like a character doesn't really understand us or only understands us on this very superficial level, such as recognizing keywords, we basically don't necessarily have agency, right, in our relationship with that character. Often we think of agency as game design as this idea of sort of being able to go anywhere, do anything. But a very specific definition of agency that I like to use is one that comes from a paper by Noah Waldrop-Fruin and Mike Matthias and Stephen Dow in a paper that they wrote for DIGRA, which is a big academic game conference in 2009. And they said that so agency occurs when the actions that a player desires are among those that they can take and vice versa, as supported by an underlying computational model. And I think that's a really interesting definition, because if we think about how do you communicate an underlying computational model, well, you can make sure there's a one-to-one mapping with an existing mental model that a player already has. So an example might be driving video games, right? So driving is kind of one of the most relatable things that you can do in a video game, because we all sort of have this idea of how to drive, right? Even if we don't have our license or whatever, like we have some idea of how to steer a vehicle and that the fact that it accelerates and brakes and things like that, and that you can turn. And even if we're using a classic controller, like we don't even need to get into like plastic steering wheel peripherals or whatever. We sort of have this idea of knowing how to do it. And this theory as well is kind of how I think conversational AI in games can work as well. Because one thing that we all have is some idea of how to communicate with another person, right? And maybe not everyone's ideas are necessarily the same or as well thought out as someone else's, but we all know sort of how to communicate with another person. Like, we're all innately social creatures. And that's something that we can leverage, right, to ensure that our expectations for conversation that we bring from the real world are also being met in the game, which is something, obviously, that wasn't happening when I was talking to that character who only understood my keywords. So I just want to point very quickly to Eliza, which you might have heard of, which is obviously the first chatbot, right? One thing that people don't actually realize about Eliza, so you might have heard the story that Eliza was, first chatbot. Lots of people thought that they were talking to this real therapist. So it was basically designed almost as a joke by this professor at MIT, Joseph Weizenbaum, because he wanted to sort of critique that sort of model of therapy, which I forget the name of, but it's a style where you say something and then the therapist's like, oh, that's interesting, and then repeats it back to you. So he wanted to sort of critique that style of therapy. So he built this basically chatbot which mimics that style, and people got really sucked in. However, I would contend that the reason that this worked was because the underlying model of this, the computational model of this, mimicked that style of therapy, right? So the player, or the user, I guess in this case, had this fictional framing that they were talking to a therapist. And that's something that I just really want to underscore very quickly because, and this is a really important point, because I think that the idea of crafting these kind of rich, satisfying conversations in NPCs is not the same as trying to fool the player into thinking that they're human, right? So I actually massively disagree with the idea of the Turing test for several reasons. That's something I can rant to you about afterwards if you want. But I think that actually our engagement with conversational AI can be framed as this kind of fictional thing, right? We can actually engage with it in this playful way because it's actually more compelling for us to buy into the make-believe of the scenario, just like we do with the rest of when we play a game, right? We accept the rules for what they are. So in many ways, we can think of conversational AIs in games or even out of games as these sort of fictional entities. Okay, so then going back to our ideas of how conversations work and what expectations that we might have for a character that is has this rich, dynamic conversational ability. So when we talk to each other, person to person, so in addition to just listening out for keywords, right, we are also watching out for all kinds of other contextual cues. And we have all kinds of channels of information that we're communicating to each other. Because conversations are about so much more than just content, which is why, generally speaking, we don't just grunt commands at each other. And if we did grunt commands at each other, that would actually say something about us, right? It would say that we're kind of a rude person. So in addition to just the content of what they're saying, or what we're saying, we also do things like convey our social stance towards the person we're speaking to, right? The sort of tone in which we say things. It might say something of our personality, right? Are we nervous? Are we umming and ahhing? Are we being rude or polite, etc.? And are we serious or jokey as a person? And these are all types of things that we might glean from just one interaction, right? But it's also something that we kind of keep track of with each other over the entire course of a conversation or even over a series of conversations. And all of that kind of informs our opinion of who we're talking to. And also, in addition to that, the last point says agenda. So moment to moment over a conversation, we kind of have these agendas or these goals for a conversation. And that's not to use the word agenda in the political sense per se, but in terms of what are the goals driving us in a particular situation. So if we're at an interview, we want to impress the person we're talking to. If we are consoling a friend over a breakup, right, we want to be comforting and be there for them and, and cheer them up. So we have these kind of micro goals over the course of a conversation, which kind of makes the conversation feel compelling. Okay, so then what about actually building conversational AI? how can we actually bring in some of these ideas? So I've taken this graphic from an article on chatbotslife.com, which kind of gives this nice guide to the various types of sort of chatbot or conversational AI system that exists. And you can go from things that are, so if we look at the bottom two specifically, we can go from for something that's like rules-based, right? So if like this is happening, then pick this particular thing. And that's a very simple kind of system. On the harder end of the spectrum, so on the box to the bottom right, that's where you're actually generating things for the conversational AI to say. And that's harder, right? Because you're bringing in all kinds of additional technical requirements. So you'd need to take time to train data sets. You'd need to that's not to even mention all the expertise that it requires to kind of tune the output to feel like a natural, satisfying conversation. So one of the goals that we have at Spirit AI, which and so we make this tool called Character Engine, which is this SDK and authoring tool. So one of the goals is that we wanted to make it way easier through use of these tools for writers, narrative designers, non-programmers to be able to create these expressive characters. And not just do that, but do it through a system which is powerful and does a lot of that work for you. And really does a lot of work to sort of help you get the texture of conversations right. So get it to feel satisfying, etc. So writers are able to create characters who are able to sort of autonomously respond to players, whether that's in the sort of fully fledged VR environment and you're sort of responding to gestures and using kind of actual speech input and having the character respond to you naturalistically via speech output, or whether it's just using a 2D game with dialogue options which are generated, again, on the fly based on the contextual situation that you're in. So characters have a memory of where a conversation has gone so far. They know what they want to say to you from their particular narrative possibility space that they have. And they can draw dynamically from their sort of particular narrative possibility space. And they can sort of decide how to sort of phrase things or rephrase things depending on their personality or their current emotional state. So if they're angry, maybe they'll be more curt with you, like if you've pissed them off or whatever. If you've made them nervous, maybe they'll add in all of these speech disfluencies like or ah. And all of this, so all of this really means that as the player, you have this sense of agency within the conversation, right? Because your mental model of a conversation is, well, I want to affect the person I'm talking to. And so the system sort of endeavors to try to do that. So very quickly, to explain sort of how the system works without getting into too much technical detail, so authors can provide these sort of two sources for characters to draw from. So kind of like, so there's kind of a story space, like I mentioned, where they're able to, so that characters know sort of the narrative space they exist in and can improvise based on that. But then there's also like a structured database that they can draw from, right? So they can pull in any type of structured information into the world. So let's say this is a character in an MMO. They're able to know when a particular mob has been killed and talk to you about it, right? Because the game state, the world state has been updated. So I'm just going to play a quick video. I don't think this has got audio. So this is from an in-house demo that the Spirit AI team made at GDC, showing how responses are kind of formulated, right? So this is the idea of how characters look at the sort of contextual situation they're in and sort of form their sort of sentences based on, again, what their personality is, what the current emotional state is that they're in, what the player has just said, and all of these things, because you want the feeling that the character is really responding to you and really understands you. So this is kind of representing, so we made this kind of like Westworld-style interface, right, where it's kind of very apparent, like we're surfacing to the player exactly how the underlying system works, and then doing it via means of this kind of higher-end avatar. But conversational AI can be compelling in all kinds of situations, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of high fidelity type thing. You can also think of a sort of 2D AR game, right, where you sort of where you converse with characters using sort of natural speech. This is a screenshot from an updated version of a game that I worked on a few years ago called Redshirt, which was this space station social simulator, which I'm updating to use natural language as well, using Character Engine. So I just want to talk very quickly about these sort of 4 types, as I mentioned, of expressive interactions that AI kind of makes possible, right, by taking advantage of existing mental models that we have. So think of these as sort of design inspirations of things that are currently possible if you use the right kind of conversational system for your AI. So firstly, like I've mentioned, like natural language input. So you might think that the idea of sort of typing sort of freely to a character just sounds like it sort of adds an additional layer of sort of friction to an interaction with a character, but there's various situations in which it kind of works, right? So again, even though it's not a game, like Eliza, the original chatbot, you can sort of think of it like as I mentioned, a fictional framing in which you're talking to a therapist via this terminal, so it kind of works, right? The fictional framing is there. So this is a screenshot from a game called Event Zero, which some of you might have played. And in this particular fictional framing, right, you're typing to a sort of ship's AI, right? So you're talking to an AI system via these terminals. So because, again, the mental model that the player has been given because of the fictional framing matches the way that the interaction works, this is a really nice example of one way that you might do a sort of conversational AI game. Going back to the idea of MMOs, right? So an MMO is another great example of where conversational, natural language input might be suitable because you're already talking to other players via those means, right? So you're sort of matching the sort of way that you're used to speaking to other entities in the game, like whether they're real players or NPCs. So you can imagine characters who can genuinely, through responsive conversation, like help you learn how to play an MMO and sort of help you as if it were another player helping you. And again, this isn't, I just want to underscore again, this isn't about fooling the player into thinking that they're playing with a real player. It's about letting them sort of buy into that experience, right? It's about sort of creating these opportunities for rich conversation, even though they know it's a sort of simulated or fictional character. What about interactions which match another mental model we have, right, which is that of communicating with real people via text, via mobile phone, right? So this is obviously a very strong mental model that we have. We do this all the time. We get out our phones. We exchange messages with people. And we've seen some examples of games which kind of match that narrative games which match that model, right, of sort of getting out your device and then sort of checking to see if there's been any updates. So Bury Me, My Love to the left there, which I mentioned before, and this is Lifeline, which is a game about sort of helping this stranded astronaut, right, as when they've crash landed. So they sort of message you periodically, and sort of you're playing it kind of in this very pervasive way over this sort of drawn-out period of time. And I think there's some really exciting possibilities there when you bring in natural language input to this, right? So imagine just being able to text on your phone to both your real friends and these stories which are unfolding with your simulated friends as well. So I think there's some really compelling opportunities there. Very quickly as well, voice interfaces. So I think this is particularly pertinent for younger players as well, right? We've got kind of a whole generation of kids growing up interacting with things like Alexa and Siri, where that's kind of often their first or primary means of interaction with a computational system. So often kids, and without going too much into the research on this, kids are actually more sort of receptive to talking to these, to sort of voice interface type games. So this is, I won't play this just in interest of time. So there's, this is just another example of like an AR, well, I guess I'll play while I'm talking, of kind of an AR character sort of activated by voice. So this was one of our partners, Deutsche Telekom, who built this kind of innovation jam prototype using our tech. So again, you know, all kinds of modalities where this can be applied. Also, dynamically generated input options is another really interesting one, right? So there might be situations where you don't want to type, or you don't want the player to have to type because you want to sort of give them options, which might be the mode of interaction they're used to. But imagine generating those options based on context, right? Based on what have you said to the player, to the character previously? What is the current sort of emotional relationship between you and the character? So you can come up and generate these very contextually specific conversation options. Finally, just the fifth bonus point. So all of this work that I've described that we've put into understanding conversations and the context of conversations means that not only can we understand conversations when they're between a player and an NPC, but we can also understand interactions between players. Because we also make this tool, which is called Ally, which I won't go into too much, but it's about combating online harassment in games. Because again, conversations are very contextually specific. There's a lot going on beyond just the words that are used. It's about the relationship that people have with each other before and sort of tone and all kinds of things. So, you know, an example, particularly when you're talking about playing games, I might be okay when my best friend calls me a name, but it's not okay if a total stranger calls me the same name, right? So again, language very contextually specific. Okay, so hopefully that was a good whirlwind tour through sort of the idea of AI, and particularly conversational AI, and how we can use it to change games, characters, and how we play through these sort of various different input modalities, right? Natural language, sort of these pervasive character-based games, voice interfaces, and so on, and also improving interactions between players as well. Okay, thank you very much. You can find my work here. Yeah, thanks very much, everyone.